America, my name is Osei-Frimpong, and we're going to do a series of videos. I'm going to try to do a little bit of content every day about governing in the age of Corona, governing in the age of COVID-19, and what that means for our politics, and maybe how it reveals other political problems that we had before that we kind of ignored, and maybe we were a little bit too comfortable with, and how maybe we can come out of this pandemic with a better sense of what it means to govern in a self-determining nation, right? So this is a resource for other political people who might not be able to campaign now because of social distancing. And in order to pull this off, I have with us a real live candidate. This is Richard Dean Winfield. He's a philosophy professor at the University of Georgia, and he's running for U.S. Senate. And he's going to, today's topic is going to be what the school closures mean about our politics, what they've revealed, and maybe how we could have done better, not necessarily with the closures, but with the politics governing both what schools are doing before and what they could be doing afterwards when and if this happens again. So I'm going to let Richard talk. So what's the proposal?
Well, I think we have to, first of all, consider why we are where we are today and facing a shutdown of education at many levels and at some levels, particularly levels of higher education, not a shutdown, but a going online of education. And if you think back what has led up to this in our country, in many countries, but not all countries of the world, it's the fact that we have sort of let our pants down in regard to the outbreak of the coronavirus. You know, it's been raging in China for more than 2 months. This should be something that the world community was ready to act upon and provide international preparations to contend with the potential spread of the virus. And that means, above all, getting a testing regime in place with sufficient numbers of testing kits so that one doesn't have to be blind, being in a situation where one can't know who really is carrying the virus and be able to thereby control its transmission. Instead, we're in a situation where we don't know, we don't have enough testing kits, and as a result, the only thing we can do, it seems, is engage in these severe measures of so-called social distancing,
Right.
which has led to, severe measures with regard to education.
Yeah, I have a question about, people want to make a distinction between what happened in Katrina 10, 15 years ago, what happened with the financial market crash and this pandemic. But there's a way in which there are all varieties of political problems with maybe natural antecedents, but our situation isn't necessarily the case right now because of nature. It's because of how we've structured our society. And you're telling me that this is a political problem, much like the response to Hurricane Katrina was a political problem, and much like, well, it's obvious that the financial crisis was a function of poorly structured markets, although some people will say that was animal spirit, so that was natural also. So I like that you're making a distinction between the pandemic as a disease and the pandemic as how the disease ravaged our inadequate politics.
Yeah. I mean, I think we have to keep in mind that we're dealing with something that from the very beginning had the potential to be a global problem, a global crisis. And that means it had to be dealt with by global institutions. And we do have a United Nations. Obviously, it's limited, and the United States in recent years has shown it very, very little support, and in many respects boycotted and undermined many of its institutions, but it still is there as an instrument of world policy that can respond to emergencies. On the other hand, you have to recognize that nations have very different policies with regard to family, with regard to work, with regard to the balance of work and family, with regard to how politics and economic relations are intertwined. So nations come into this crisis with different kind of institutions and policies in place that give them different degrees of preparedness. And we, in many respects, are in a rather mixed bag. We are the wealthiest nation in human history. We have unmatched military and technological resources. But on the other hand, we are genuine laggards when it comes to providing health care to our people, in a way that is completely comprehensive and affordable. We're laggards with regard to balancing work and family and providing the basic forms of support for families. We don't have family leave, paid family leave. We don't have child allowances. We don't have any guarantee of paid sick leave. And of course, we tolerate homelessness. In all of these respects, we are leaving ourselves very vulnerable to the spread of an illness like the COVID-19 in ways that not every other nation is susceptible.
So you're saying that you were saying before that it's possible that we didn't even have to, if we were organized correctly, we didn't necessarily even have to close schools.
And you know, you can take the example of Singapore. Now, I've just read about this. I'm not going to claim that I have completely accurate information upon this, but apparently Singapore has managed to drastically contain the spread of the COVID-19 virus without having to engage in shutting down of schools or other commercial establishments. And they've done it by having an extremely pervasive testing regime where they're testing people on a daily basis, apparently. And they've been able to identify who are carriers and to both treat them and isolate them and really stop the spread of the coronavirus in the bud. Now, if we had been prepared and not been sitting on our rear ends like deer in the headlights, you know, we would have immediately started ensuring that there were testing kits being produced on a mass scale so that we had the resources to test everyone in the country.
Have that kind of productive capacity?
Well, clearly, I mean, look, the capacity is there, but it's not being used for this purpose. We have to mobilize it. And that requires public mobilization. We can't rely on this rather phony private-public partnership that Trump recently put out on display, which, by the way, involved no participation on the largest part of the public, namely employees and labor. It were simply business owners and Trump himself. Of course, his cabinet is full of similar kinds of people with the same kind of social position, representing a tiny fraction of our population. It's severely anti-democratic and oligopolistic. But if we were prepared, we'd be in a different situation. Now, admittedly, we don't have the testing kits, but we have to ramp that up as soon as possible. So that then leaves us with the question, are we going to make use of social distancing? And in particular, are we going to do what is being done with the shutting down of person-to-person education? Now, this has different ramifications when we're considering higher education. Because in higher education, first of all, we're dealing with people who, if they can't be engaged in higher education in person, they're not going to be individuals who need childcare, for example. They can more or less continue to operate on their own, provided, of course, they have the means of living. And it's possible, in most cases, to carry on with their education by making use of online resources, because by and large, they will have access to broadband. Now, not in every case. They had broadband on university campuses. When they're now dispersed, that's a little bit more iffy. But it's still possible. It's still feasible to think that we can carry on, obviously in a manner that is not as good as person-to-person education, but that can be done.
Right. So what's at issue is that closing down universities doesn't jeopardize civil society in the same way, or strain civil society, or even the family in the same way that shutting down elementary schools and high schools does.
Yeah. Now, if you think about what happens immediately when we shut down schools, first of all, you have to think about the way schools have operated in our society as a very imperfect stopgap for our failure to provide for the welfare of families. And I'm talking about the way in which our public schools in particular are providing food for children who come from families that, to use this Orwellian phrase, are food, not food endangered, at some kind of food risk. Yeah. In other words, they're suffering from malnutrition, if not starvation, because they don't have enough money to pay for the food they need. So we offer subsidized lunches, sometimes breakfast, sometimes even dinners, depending upon the school system, to children. Now, of course, if we shut down the schools, the children are deprived of these features. Sometimes also they're given certain kinds of medical treatment in schools that they can't otherwise afford, because not only do not do Americans not have health insurance universally, but even those that do, including Medicaid, can't afford the deductibles and copays that are involved. So now we have a situation where if we feel the only way to halt the spread of the virus is to shut down public schools, then we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to make up for the services schools provide to children?
But they should have been providing those services, or maybe they shouldn't have been providing those services, and we should have actually instituted policies that decoupled medical and nutrition from schools.
Well, in a way, I mean, when you talk about decoupling these services from various institutions, this becomes a very stark issue when we now consider what happens now with children who can't go to school. They need to be cared for.
All right.
And if we're going to shunt them off into daycare centers, we're really doing nothing different than keeping them in school because they're still in large groups ordinarily. So if we really want to shut down the schools and have children be separated from one another, the easiest remedy is to have a parent take care of them at home. Right. But that means we're talking about large numbers of parents who are working, having to stay home from work. And there are two sides to this. On the one hand, under our current situation, people do not get paid sick leave, do not get paid family leave. So how can a parent afford to stay home and care for their children if they have no resources, no funds to take care of their basic needs? Secondly, in our nation, for many people, if you have health insurance, it's tied to your employment. So if you now leave work, you may be leaving your medical insurance and not be able to either care for yourself, let alone any of your dependents. And then, of course, we have to deal with the fact that we cannot shut down all occupations. There are some occupations where people can work from home, but many others, particularly those that involve key, crucial human services, require one-on-one personal contact.
Oh, those people don't get to have children.
Well, that then becomes
Nope.
An issue. But
No children for them.
But if we're shutting down the schools, we've got to care for the children, and that means not only do we have to provide paid family leave for the parents, but we have to ensure that everyone remains covered by, well, let's put it this way, that everyone will have health care, irrespective of their resources. And there's another side to that, and that is that, even if we talk about people having a living wage, let alone a fair wage, a living wage that lets them survive, the living wage is calculated in terms of a figure that applies to all individuals, no matter how many dependents they have. But if you have children, dependents, you need extra funding.
Yeah.
And according to the government's own figures, you need approximately $900 per month to care for each child.
Right.
Well, that means in these circumstances, we really have to go to bat and provide child allowances right now to provide for the cost of children, which we always should be providing. We have to provide paid family leave right away. And we have to ensure that everyone is covered by health care.
So these child allowances, you would argue that they would actually be a permanent feature of our government. It's just their need is highlighted now because of the coronavirus.
I mean, all of these things should have been in place, and in many countries they are in place. If they were in place, people could stay at home and take care of things,
Right.
and it's not as if the government would have to engage in different or special emergency measures. These would be part of the normal fabric of a society that cares for its people and allows them to exercise their freedoms.
Right.
But the other side of it is we cannot allow our economic activities to simply cease. Now, some of them, as I mentioned, can be done from home, but not all can be done from home. And we can't give up essential services, to say the least, that involve the providing of food, the distribution of food, health care, housing, maintenance of housing, all the kinds of human services we need, medical services and the like. And then, of course, if we were going to let all of these other operations fall by the wayside, we have to think about what happens to the people living there and the general economic collapse. We really have to think about retaining as much economic activity as possible by organizing it in a way where its employees are operating in as safe conditions as possible. They're all provided with paid sick leave so that if they do fall ill, they're not going to stay on the job and infect other people. And in this way, we can retain as much of the economic functioning we need because, we can't afford to have an economy that entirely collapses. There are services that have to be maintained.
Someone has to produce.
That's not to say they can be maintained without any risk at all. There will be some risks, but we need to mitigate them as much as possible and carry on functioning as best as we can. And if we are going to be engaged in social distancing and shutting down certain kinds of industries which involve congregations of a large amount of people, cruise ships, restaurants, entertainment events, live entertainment,
Huge economies.
Schools in a way. These are very important parts of our economy. We have to make sure that we are providing a livelihood to employees and to ensure that the businesses themselves are not going to cease to exist. And we need immediately to provide the resources to do that. But when we think about the schools, we also have to think about the children, their welfare, the welfare of their parents. And by the way, when we talk about children being more or less kept from school, we have to take into account that we, to our miserable disgrace, have hundreds of thousands of children who are homeless, who don't have a home to go back to. And homelessness in general is a threat not only to our conscience and to the humanity of the people who suffer it, but also to the spread of the coronavirus. We have to really right now step to the plate and do what we have never done. Guarantee and provide housing to every single homeless person and every single homeless child so that they can sequester at home and have what they need to live decently and carry on. And at some point, we have to recognize that the fact that we are able in many circumstances to consider carrying on higher education with the idea that the students are going to have access to online instruction, we have to do something we haven't done, which is becoming more and more crucial in an age of pandemics. We have to guarantee, as just a basic part of what it means to have decent housing, to have broadband at home. If we all had broadband at home, we could carry on public education.
Yes.
Like we're carrying on higher education and do it remotely.
It would be an institution of productivity.
Exactly.
Because productivity is going to cease. I'm as worried about productivity as I am about consumer power.
Yeah.
So I worry about, are we still producing enough things to get on the shelves?
Yeah.
Logistics so a communications infrastructure seems to at least address that. A serious communications infrastructure seems to address productivity in a way that just giving people cash doesn't.
Yeah, and I think to maintain the ability of people to work,
right,
and do the things that we need in order to survive as a society and be able to treat people and protect people and keep people in houses that are maintained and so forth, we really have to put a priority on providing testing to those who are working.
Yes.
And particularly in essential jobs.
Yeah.
They have to be tested ASAP so they can know who among them is sick and needs to be treated and isolated and those who do not, so they can carry on with their functioning. And if we could have done that a while back, we could have, in a sense, avoided a lot of the social distancing that's going on. But we haven't had it. Now we need to introduce it, and as we do it more and more, then we can put things back into operation. We can resume schooling at a certain point in person. And we need to do that as soon as possible. We need to get things running again. In the interim, we have to, provide for people. And there's no issue with the government being able to provide individuals with funds they need for child allowances. There are 75 million children in the country. If you give them each $900 per month, we're talking about something that becomes, a sizable amount, but it's a drop in the bucket compared with the amount of wealth that's controlled by the top 1%.
Right.
And we don't have to worry about having the tax receipts or the deficit spending already at hand, we can go ahead using our fiscal policy and our federal banking system to distribute the funds to people. And later we can deal with it in various ways. One way is expanding the money supply. Now, admittedly, there are risks of inflation if you rely on that under conditions where production is diminishing, because then you have fewer goods compared to the amount of money, and that is going to drive inflation. On the other hand, now with interest rates collapsing,
do we even have interest rates anymore?
Yeah, they're not yet negative, but that means it's a great time for the United States to sell bonds and engage in deficit spending, because people are looking desperately for some place to put their money with the stock market cratering and everything. So we could use deficit spending in a very affordable way. On the other hand, we can also tax in a way that is responsible and put the entire burden, as we should, on those who can bear that burden most easily with the least restriction on their activities. And that means you put the tax burden on those who have the most money, and in particular the top 1% and the top 10%. And that can be done. The funds are there. Even if the stock market is collapsing, there's still plenty there. And we need to move quickly and provide people that rock bottom security and opportunity. And then we can get America working again as it was and better than ever before, because we can continue with these policies, which should have been in place before this ever happened. So then a lot of what is happening would not have happened.
Right. If testing, if we already have child allowances, if we already have testing, if we already have the public awareness to understand that this is a pandemic, and
let's not forget, of course, Medicare for all.
Medicare for all, decoupled.
Yeah, coupled from school, from work, from everything else. It's just there. Same thing with retirement benefits and disability benefits.
And everyone has rural broadband.
Exactly. Broadband and decent housing.
Decent housing.
No one is homeless.
Then we don't take the productivity hit.
Yeah. And this is not a utopia.
Right.
It's not at all a utopia. It's something in a way that is more realizable than the mess we're getting ourselves into. Right?
Good.
And I think under the pressure of events, if we have our wits about us, we can end up coming out of this much better than we were before and minimize the effects of what we're giving. And not have a generation that has lost the time to educate themselves. We don't want to keep schools closed for very long.
Right.
We want our kids getting back into their educational system. We should consider this at most a spring vacation, an extended spring vacation, and we do everything we can to get the schools up and running as soon as possible.
And preferably then decouple these services from schools.
Exactly.
and put them where they ought to be.
Exactly.
And provide parents and children with the kind of resources that they deserve. Yeah. So thank you. And once again, I wanted to do this series to help candidates who are right now at home because they can't campaign know how to talk about the coronavirus. And there's a difference between organizing and activism, right? In activism, you tell truth to power. Yeah. In organizing, you're trying to actually grow people's capacity to govern. That's what these videos are. We're trying to grow your capacity to govern, both yourself and that entails with other people. So go ahead and send this video around to all your friends. And if you like what the candidate, Dr. Winfield, is saying, you can just put Winfield for Senate in Google. And he's running on policies that he will be detailing for you every morning for about 25 minutes. And you can find him at Winfield for Senate, put it in Google, and, give a little bit of money because campaigns don't run themselves. So I will see you tomorrow, and we'll talk about another pandemic-influenced aspect of how we govern this nation. Thank you for your time, and peace.